Well, Anthea, this is fabulous. We're really sorry you won't be able to join us for the event, but thank you so much for being willing to talk with us about your project.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
I was really excited about your project because I thought this is exactly, fits with inner development into the whole field of activism. It was so much fitted with what was behind our grant giving.
Well, I have to say I was equally excited to see your call for applications when you first started, because it's the first time I'd seen a funder really speaking so explicitly about the place where our inner lives and our potential for development meet the changes that we want to make in the outside world. So yeah, so my background is as well. First, as a journalist, I started out as a reporter at the Times, but after a few years, I left that and I went to do campaigning in NGOs, which I did for a decade and a half. I worked for Amnesty, I worked for Christian Aid, I worked for Global Witness, and I was doing investigations. I was using my journalistic skills to look at human rights abuses, to look at environmental damage caused by corporations.
Right.
So there were some successes in that, but at the same time, I was starting to feel that there were limits to what I was doing, and I was experiencing real sort of concerns, both in a sort of cognitive thinking way and also sort of deeper in my being about it. One of them was that in the time I was spending in the mountains, climbing and walking to recover from my campaigning exertions during the week, I was coming to a deeper green awareness, and realizing the extent to which we completely need to change our relationship to the biosphere and the basis of life, and that the kinds of changes that I was arguing for were ultimately tweaks within a system that is still based on extraction. I was also realizing that we were, and all NGOs were, and all campaigning seemed to be, mimicking aspects of the systems that we wanted to change. And the ways in which I was most aware I was doing it at that point, I now realise much more, was that we were sort of mimicking the sort of homo economicus assumptions of a rational actor, on which is based the economic systems that we're trying to change. And we were effectively doing the same thing by putting reports full of carefully sourced facts that I'd made sure that we could publish without ending up in a libel court, putting these facts in front of the policymaker and expecting them to change. Now, that was working, and to an extent, under New Labour, under certain regimes. When I was starting out campaigning, that was working. But since 2010, that has been working a lot less. And so a few years ago, when I was starting to realise this, that was part of it. I was also noticing the way that we weren't always treating the people we were working with or who we were trying to help very well. And in my deeper self, I was experiencing, and I didn't really have the words for it at the time, a sort of desiccation that I can now understand in slightly more spiritual terms, that came from only using a small proportion of my capabilities, the sort of rational thinking, arguing side, and it was leaving the rest of me sort of stuck and blocked. And I wanted to be feeling more whole in the way that I was doing my work, in a way that the entire model of that kind of NGO policy campaigning just did not have space for. Right. So I left my job as a campaigns director, and during that time got to know Perspectiva, which was just starting up, as an organisation, a research organisation that was thinking about the ways in which we need to make changes in our inner lives in order to bring more effective change in the world outside. It's not a campaign group, it's definitely a thinking and talking about it and sharing ideas group. But there seemed to be some synergies between what we were thinking. And so I started thinking about activism, and it was at that point that I came to you with this idea to develop a project that was about the relationship between spiritual development and societal change.
It's great to get a picture of how the whole thing grew and developed in yourself. What did the grant enable you to actually do?
What I wanted to do was put in context all of these feelings with which and intuitions and senses with which I'd left what I was doing. So I needed to talk to other activists, first of all, to find out the extent to which those understandings were shared. And they were. And people were saying, yes, we do need to talk about this. And what was interesting was that, well, what was interesting for me, because there was an aspect of having to recognise my own privilege as a white middle class person working in well-funded NGOs, the extent to which I'd been shielded from having to grapple with some of these issues, that people who've been fighting for their lives rather than choosing to intervene on behalf of others,
that's a great point,
might have had to grapple with much more quickly. What this project has enabled us to do is find a frame and a way of talking about the links between our inner lives and the change that we want to bring in the world, and a way of explaining also why it matters. It's quite easy for people who are very busy trying to change the world to say, well, why should we attend to what's going on inside? Why should we be looking at this when things are so urgent? Why also should we be giving ammunition to the other side who would love to find ways to criticize us? Why should we be sort of looking at this stuff that allows them to say, oh, right, well, you really are hypocritical and righteous and so on. We've always been saying this about you. But actually, I think it's not a submission to power to look at how power runs through us and can make us its agent. The frame that we've come to is the idea of entangled activism. We are entangled in what it is that we're trying to change. And we're entangled in multiple ways. Now, that can sound quite straightforward. I mean, obviously, we're entangled in the systems we're trying to change. We want to leave fossil fuels in the ground, and yet we're dependent for all the basics of life on them. Some of it's a bit deeper at the next level down and slightly harder to see. The ways in which we are driving ourselves to burnout, working relentlessly to try and change systems that are themselves based on endless work and endless extraction. So we're running that system within ourselves. The way that we're talking about rights and justice and yet not treating people well. The way that we're shouting loudly to save others from harm while perhaps placating some of our own needs for recognition and security. But some of it's at the very deepest level, this entanglement of how we see the world. Now, that very basic phrase that people always used about me, that my mum's friends would use about me when I started campaigning, oh, you're off saving the world. We're trying to change the world. It's in that grammatical structure. We, the subject, are trying to change the world, the object. Now, that is an entanglement, I think, in the deepest perceptions of liberal Enlightenment modernity, the scientific revolution, which allowed us to start to see the world in objective terms, that put us as the Cartesian subject and everything else as the object. Yes. We carry that into our campaigning. This isn't sort of just of sort of intellectual interest. I think it's strategically really important, because if we think the problem is over there in this object that we're trying to change or help, and that we are not the problem, then we're making the strategic error of locating the problem in the wrong place. The world that we are trying to change, these systems that we're trying to change, have had an effect on us. And it's actually one of the deepest effects of that system is to convince us that we are separate. You know, that's the great sort of triumph of individualism, is to make us think that we're separate from things. And so here we are using these very useful tools that have given us the language and the structures of human rights, for example, very helpfully, to try and free people from oppression. And yet, baked into those ideas about individualism are a way of perceiving in a subject and object way that completely goes against the kind of intersubjective relating that would truly change how we come into relation with everyone and everything who's not us.
So practically, how did you go about bringing this material out from people?
So a lot of it was in conversations. I interviewed a lot of activists, and it came up in those conversations. We also used some of the funding to do a couple of events. We did a sort of more intensive workshop where we were working with Sophie Banks, who's a really amazing facilitator who's got a background in psychotherapy and in systems thinking, to bring in her way of looking at how the systems that we're trying to change manifest through group systems, and what happens in the movements and groups that we're in trying to do our campaigning. And activists came to that from a really wide variety of issues that they were working on and types of organisations. And we also did a big event which was aimed at people who, I suppose, are self-identifying as activists as well as people who are not identifying as activists, because I'm interested also in the way that when we define ourselves as activists, and that idea, when we take on that identity, it's like we sort of put on a sort of cloak of I'm the activist, and immediately something happens in how we are interacting with people who are uncomfortable with
That's
that.
interesting.
And including, I mean, of course, there'll be people who want to sort of go like that and don't want anything to do with it, as we've seen with this legislation that's going through at the moment, that protest. And then while I've been doing that, I've been writing a book to put it together.
Is that you're still working on that book, or
it's coming very soon? It's hopefully in May.
I can't wait to read it.
It's called The Entangled Activist: Learning to Recognise the Master's Tools. I wanted to do something to really bring together all of what's happening, and it felt like the way to do it that was most appropriate for me to be able to speak about this, because I had to sort of own my own entanglements in this, my own story of how I've come to see this. Felt like the best way to try and convey it. And that's complicated, because here I am ultimately saying we need to do some work on ourselves, right? So the conclusion is, we need to do, if we're entangled, the first thing we have to do is stop denying it. The first thing we have to do is acknowledge it, and then see what that does to change our starting point. And actually it changes quite a lot, making that mental shift. But some of the work to be done for people who've been coming to their activism with privilege of various forms, and I'm included in that category, is perhaps to step back and say, well, this isn't about me. If I'm truly going to do this from a position of service rather than meeting all of my own subconscious and unacknowledged needs, then it's going to look very differently. The work that I do in solidarity is going to look different. And so the book is a reflection on the activism that I have done through the insights I have gained through this project.
Fantastic. How has it impacted people, and how are they seeing the effect in their own lives of the work?
In the short term, I suppose in the events, we've seen that thing where participants are, when you can see, because you've experienced it yourself, that moment where somebody's going, oh, and something's landing. And then I think this fits into a wider process that's going on, and a lot of it is already explicit around the issues of power and privilege and representation.
Yes.
And some of it also is about questions of sort of martyrdom and sacrifice and burnout, and some of those questions. And these are all sort of live issues, and there are ways to bring them together. And I think this kind of thinking can help bring them together and see what's going on.
Right.
And there are other things as well. So I think there's a cultural moment here that this fits into, of activism becoming, and culture, actually, because activism is only part of culture, but it's both, really, becoming more aware of itself.
Yes.
At the same time, this is happening also because there's a lot of activism going on. And the reason there's a lot of activism going on is because stuff is up politically, right? Polarization is happening. The effect of social media is profound. The end game of neoliberalism and the effects of repeated sort of like layers of austerity kicking in is producing a whole generation of radicalized people, ongoing injustices that have been going on for a long time, and that are now being expressed in ways that reach more people because of the way that social media works. So old stories are being brought home to new people, I suppose. All of that, and then the reaction to it, which is, we have right-wing governments that are quite willing to stoke culture war in their terms, and to take away fundamental freedoms in order to disguise the fact
yes,
what they're up to economically, and to try and keep the vote of people whom they're actually harming in material and economic terms. Or, all of that there is the context. And so we need to resource ourselves.
We do, because we don't have the power as such.
And I find it really heartening, like some of the conversations I have with people in their early 20s, even late teens, they have just instantly got
They've got it.
In terms of like structurally understanding the interconnections of the systemic problem, they are there in a way that I wasn't until I was into my 30s. And that's cultural emergence. That's great.
Yeah. God, do we need it?
And yet, the ongoing problems caused by human psychology, and our inability to sort of get to grips with ourselves, will always arise, which is why I think there's always a need for this work.
Great to talk with you, Anthea. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for your time. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And look forward to staying in touch. It's great.